Hello everybody and welcome to Hurds Hill, and you found me in the yellow drawing room, and you can probably see behind me this is where we keep a lot of our books. In fact, this is the collection of 1,000 cookery books, and I was looking through some of my old books last night and came across quite a few to do with Mrs Beeton, and I thought, well, it's about time I told you about me and Mrs Beeton. There have been two women who have influenced my desire to cook. One was my mother, who taught me how to make an omelette when I was 7, and then trotted me around to all the neighbours to do the demonstrations if they'd all got a spare egg. So that was the beginning of my cooking career. And then secondly, I came across Mrs Beeton, and I'm partly responsible for creating the mythology around Mrs Beeton, but I wanted to put the record straight with you. So Mrs Beeton was a young woman. Her father died when she was about 2 years old, and her mother remarried a Mr Mason, who was the clerk of Epsom Racecourse. And in fact, she lived in the racecourse stand when she was a child. However, that might have been the equivalent of being the managing director, I think, because they were well enough off to send her to a finishing school in Germany for a year. And when she came back after that period, she was about 19, she met a fellow called Sam Beeton and fell madly in love with Sam. And they were duly married and went to live in Pinner. Now, Sam was a very smart, creative publishing entrepreneur and already had his own business, S.O. Beeton, and published, generally speaking, magazines. And one of the magazines he published very successfully was the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine. And I have that here, which I'll show you in a moment. But when Isabella Beeton married Sam, she immediately began working. And she went to the office with him every day, and she started to write and compile the cookery section and the household management section for this magazine, the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine. And it was so popular that in 1861 all the material was collected together in a huge book, which was Mrs Beeton's Book of Cookery and Household Management, which is now what we know her for. There is a sort of an idea that she was a kind of a rather dumpy, aproned matron in her kind of upstairs, downstairs kitchen. That's not the case at all. She was a very, very smart entrepreneurial businesswoman. She was a young woman. She had the ability to manage this household management concept by asking readers to contribute recipes. So a lot of the recipes came from the readers. A lot of them were existing from previous kind of writers, and she did compilations of them. And the book was hugely successful. It sold 60,000 copies in its first year, and in the first 5 years it sold 2 million copies. So where do I fit in? This is what I did. This is a massive tome. When I was running Wardlock, which was the publisher that published this book, I decided I would reinvent Mrs Beeton, and I noticed that I published this in 1990. And it was a complete revised edition of Mrs Beeton's Cookery and Household Management. Fortunately, it was a runaway bestseller at the time, so I'm very pleased about that. But the thing about Mrs Beeton is that she did leave us quite a few legacies. Unfortunately, and the surprising thing is, she died at the age of 29, and she died in childbirth. And this was the 4th attempt at giving birth that she'd had over a very short married life. So unfortunately, she died at 29, which was 2 years after the Book of Household Management was published in 1861. And following that sad occasion, Sam really went to pieces a little bit and ended up selling his business to Wardlock, which is why I came in here. But she revolutionized cookery, writing and reading, because she was the first person to create recipes in the way that we know them now. It's putting ingredients and then method. Previously, it had all been jumbled up from start to finish. It was just written in a narrative. She also introduced colour into cookbooks. I don't know if you can see this, Julie, but this is a typical colour page from the Cookery and Household Management book. but this is a spin-off book done sort of later called Family Cookbook. I unfortunately don't have a copy of the original edition, which is worth about £3,000. But I do have the Domestic Woman's Magazine. She also said quite a few prolific things. I was surprised when I was reading through some of my notes that she was the person that said a place for everything and everything in its place. I think that's rather smart. But she was also interested in making life easier for women at home and in the kitchen. And she wrote a few things to give guidance to women in the house. And one of the things I like is that she says, small disappointments, petty annoyances, and other everyday incidents should never be mentioned to your friends. Which I thought doesn't ring true today, but at that time she was advising you don't gossip and tittle tattle. But she had a really, really strong, what we would now recognize as a management skill. And the advice that she gives to women is relevant today. And it's what I will teach when I'm running leadership and management seminars, a version of this. She says, get up early, moderate your feelings, understand accounts, cost and price each item in advance, and I like this one, and allocate clear duties to your servants. I think we should all do that, don't you? So if you've enjoyed this, I'm going to do more book reviews and looking back at some historical things. So please go to our YouTube channel, Hurds Hill, and click on subscribe, and also you can click on notification to find out what other things we have.